Marry me. The words cut through the saloon's thick air of stale beer and desperation. They were not a plea, but a proposal of iron, laid on the table between them like a loaded pistol. Caleb looked up from his watered-down whiskey. The woman who spoke was Ilara, a figure carved from the hard-packed earth of the territory itself. She was tall, broad-shouldered, a giantess in a world of stooped men, with a face that held the impassive beauty of a granite cliff face. Her late husband had owned the largest spread in the valley, and his death had left her not bereft, but burdened. "I need a husband," she continued, her voice low and devoid of sentiment. "A man's name on the deed to keep the vultures at bay. You need a home. I've seen you, sleeping in the livery, taking scraps of work no one else will touch. You look like a man who has lost everything." Caleb's hand tightened around his glass. He had. He said nothing. His silence was a hollowed-out space where a life used to be. Ilara's eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed him without pity. "This isn't a romance. It's a contract. You'll have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and hard work to keep your hands busy. I'll have a man on the land. In a year, if there's a child, the western quarter of the ranch is yours, free and clear. If not, you walk away with a good horse and $100. No attachments." She leaned forward, the worn fabric of her dress straining against her powerful frame. A smirk, not of pleasure but of grim pragmatism, touched her lips. "Take the deal, rancher. I'll give you a reason to wake up in the morning. And in this life, that's a damn sight more than most men have." Caleb stared into the amber liquid of his glass, but he didn't see the saloon. He saw fire. He saw the night the wind turned against them, a hungry, howling beast that carried sparks from the grasslands to the dry timbers of his small home. He remembered the smell of smoke, thick and suffocating, and the sound of his wife, Sarah, screaming his name before the roar of the flames swallowed everything. He had been out, chasing down a stray calf, and had returned to a vision of hell. He'd run into the inferno, his hands blistering on the doorframe, his lungs searing, but it was too late. He had lost it all in the space of a single, terrible hour: his wife, his infant son, his home, his future. The man who walked away from that pile of ash was a ghost, a hollowed-out shell animated by nothing but grief. For 6 months, he had drifted, working just enough to eat, sleeping just enough to be haunted by nightmares. Now, in this dusty saloon, a giant of a woman was offering him not a life, but the scaffolding of one. Work. A roof. A purpose, however transactional. He looked at her hands, resting on the table. They were large, calloused, and capable. They were hands that built things, not hands that wrung themselves in despair. He thought of the alternative: another night in the hayloft, another day of gnawing emptiness, another step closer to letting the grief finally pull him under. He raised his eyes to meet hers. They were clear, unflinching. They promised nothing but the truth. "I can work," he said, his voice raw from disuse. It was the most he had spoken in weeks. A single nod was her reply. The deal was struck. That evening, they rode out of town, 2 solitary figures against a bruised purple sky, the silence between them as vast and unyielding as the land they were riding toward. The ranch was like the woman who owned it, vast, imposing, and showing signs of a hard-fought life. The house was solid, built of thick-hewn logs, but the fences sagged in places and a gate hung from a single hinge. The land itself was stubborn, a mix of rocky pastures and windswept plains that would break a lesser spirit. Ilara gave him a room at the far end of the house. It was sparse, clean, containing only a bed and a small washstand. There were no pleasantries, no tour. "The tools are in the barn," she'd said. "The stock needs tending. The fences need mending. Start with the north pasture," and he did. Caleb worked from before the sun rose until after it had bled out behind the western mountains. He spoke only when necessary, answering Ilara's direct questions with simple, direct answers. The labor was a brutal balm. The sting of sweat in his eyes was real. The ache in his back was an honest pain, a grounding force against the formless agony in his soul. He learned the language of her ranch not through words, but through action. He learned which well ran deepest, which part of the roof leaked in a hard rain, which cow was the most temperamental. In the evenings, they ate in silence at a long wooden table. She would watch him, her gaze analytical. He never complained. He never faltered. He simply worked. One afternoon, she found him not mending a fence, but rebuilding the broken gate at the entrance to the yard. He had taken the time to plane the wood smooth, to set the posts deep and true. It was more than a repair, it was an act of creation. As he swung the newly hung gate and it closed with a satisfying, solid thud, she spoke from behind him. "My husband never bothered to fix that." Caleb turned, his hand stained with dirt and pine sap. He just looked at her, then back at the gate. "It's a gate," he said. "It's supposed to work." Months bled into one another, marked by the changing seasons across the unforgiving landscape. The autumn winds gave way to the biting cold of winter, and Caleb's presence became as constant and reliable as the mountain on the horizon. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the empty, awkward silence of strangers, but the comfortable, breathing silence of two people who understood each other through shared purpose. He saw the weariness in her shoulders after a long day of bookkeeping and would have a fire roaring in the hearth when she emerged from her study. She saw the way he sometimes stared at the horizon, his eyes lost in a painful past, and would leave a plate of warm food on the table for him without a word. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, trapping them in the warm cocoon of the house, she found him by the fire, sharpening the blade of an axe with methodical, rhythmic strokes. The firelight played across the hardened planes of his face, making him look like a man forged from the same elements as the tool in his hands. "My first husband," she said, her voice pulling him from his trance. "He was a good man, but he was soft. He feared this land. And he feared me." She looked at her own large hands. "He said my strength was unnatural for a woman." Caleb stopped his work. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel ceased. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not just the imposing matriarch but the woman beneath. He saw the flicker of old hurt in her eyes. He went back to sharpening the axe, the sound filling the room once more. "I don't," he said, the two words landing with the weight of a sworn oath. In that moment, the transactional nature of their arrangement began to fracture, revealing something far more solid and genuine beneath. He was not afraid of her strength, he was a quiet reflection of it. Their quiet life was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of its disturbance eventually reached the ears of Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a man who believed the world owed him, and he believed, most of all, that it owed him Ilara's land. His family had once held a claim to the territory, a claim lost through drink and poor decisions, but in his petty, avaricious mind, it was his by right. He arrived one morning with two hired men, reining his horse up at the new gate Caleb had built. Blackwood was a stark contrast to Caleb. He was fleshy and loud, his clothes too fine for the dusty land he stood on. He smirked, a greasy expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. Well, Ilara. Heard you found yourself astray." His eyes raked over Caleb, dismissing him as nothing more than a scarecrow propped up in a field. Still hiding behind a man's name, giantess. Ilara stepped onto the porch, a rifle held loosely in the crook of her arm. She was taller than him even from that distance. "This is my land, Silas. It was bought and paid for. You have no business here." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. That land was meant for a Blackwood, not for the oversized wife of a dead man and her pet mute. He leaned on his saddle horn. "This is your only warning. Take your husband and get out. This valley doesn't have room for you." Caleb stood beside the porch, his posture unchanged. He did not speak. He did not even look at Blackwood. He simply existed, a silent, unmovable object planted in the earth. His presence was an anchor, a quiet declaration. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his face at the man's refusal to be intimidated. "Have it your way," he sneered, before turning his horse and riding off, his men following like jackals. The threat hung in the air, as real and as chilling as the first frost of winter. The encounter with Blackwood changed the air on the ranch. It was no longer just them against the land, it was them against the cruel whims of a petty tyrant. The quiet between them was now charged with a new tension, a shared vigilance. They watched the ridge lines. They noted every unfamiliar track. The threat did not break them apart, it fused them together. One night, a violent storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple-black. Thunder rattled the thick log walls of the house, and lightning threw the world into stark, momentary relief. Caleb couldn't sleep. He found Elara standing by the main window, staring out into the tempest. In the flashes of lightning, he saw that her powerful shoulders were slumped. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked not like a giant, but like a woman carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone. "He'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the howl of the wind. "He'll try to burn us out. That's his way." Malice and fire. Caleb thought of the ashes of his own past, of the fire that had taken everything. He understood that fear. He understood it better than anyone. "He's not just after the land," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the storm. "He's after the idea of it. He can't stand that a woman, that I, could hold this place together. He wants to see it, and me." Broken, Caleb moved to stand beside her, his presence a shield against the storm both outside and within. He put a hand on her shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding. Her muscles tensed for a moment, then relaxed into his touch. It was the first time they had touched with intentional comfort. "I'll stay," he said. The words were a quiet echo of their first conversation, but the meaning had changed entirely. It was no longer part of a contract. It was a vow. Blackwood's malice started like a sickness, with small, insidious symptoms. A section of fence would be cut in the night, the wire snipped clean. A few head of cattle would be spooked, scattered across the valley, forcing Caleb and Elara to spend days rounding them up. These were inconveniences meant to wear them down, to bleed their resolve dry. But they did not tire. They simply worked harder, their shared labor a silent act of defiance. Caleb would mend the fences, his knots tighter and stronger than before. Elara would ride out with him, her rifle resting across her saddle, her eye scanning the hills. Then, one morning, Caleb found a young calf with its throat cut, lying near the stream. The cruelty was no longer just mischievous, it was a clear and bloody promise of what was to come. That evening, the silence in the house was heavy, grim. Elara unlocked a long wooden box that had sat untouched since Caleb's arrival. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a heavy Winchester rifle. "My husband's," she said, her voice flat. "He wasn't much of a shot." "You need to be," she taught him in the fading light, showing him how to load, aim, and fire. He was competent, but his hands, so skilled with an axe and a hammer, felt clumsy with the firearm. He preferred the heft of the tools he understood. Every night after that, a new ritual began. After their silent dinner, Caleb would go to the porch with his felling axe and a whetstone. He would sit, drawing the stone along the curved steel blade, again and again. The sound, a rhythmic sheeing, scraped against the vast quiet of the plains. It was a meditative, deadly sound. It was the sound of a patient man preparing for violence. It was his answer to Blackwood's threats, a promise whispered not in words, but in sharpening steel. Dusk was settling over the valley, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and ash, when they came. Blackwood and 4 of his men rode not to the gate, but through the weakened fence line to the west, torches already lit in their hands. They moved with the arrogance of men who believed their victory was assured. Their intent was clear: fire. For Caleb, the sight of the approaching flames was a key turning in a lock he thought long rusted shut. The smell of burning pitch on the wind was the smell of his deepest trauma. But the man who stood on the porch now was not the broken survivor who had stumbled into town. He was a man with something to defend. As the first torch was thrown, arcing through the air toward the dry wood of the barn, something inside him snapped. He did not reach for the rifle. He grabbed his axe. Elara was already firing from an upstairs window, her shots measured and deadly, forcing the men to take cover. But Caleb moved with a different kind of fury. He was a force of nature, a quiet storm that had finally broken. He met the first man by the corner of the house, the axe swinging in a silent, brutal arc. There was no war cry, no shout of rage. There was only the terrible efficiency of a man protecting his home. The fight was a blur of chaotic motion and primal sound. Ilara's rifle cracked from above, a steady, deadly rhythm, while on the ground, Caleb moved through the attackers like a phantom. He was not a soldier, he was a protector, and his violence was as profound and absolute as his grief had once been. He cornered a terrified Silas Blackwood against the very gate he had rebuilt. The petty tyrant, his face pale in the firelight, stammered threats and pleas. Caleb said nothing. He simply raised the axe, its sharpened edge gleaming, a final, wordless judgment. The aftermath was quiet, the silence broken only by the crackle of the single fire Blackwood had managed to start, which Caleb and Ilara quickly extinguished. The law, when it arrived the next morning, was a formality. The sheriff looked at the bodies, at the discarded torches, at the axe leaning against the porch railing, and at the steadfast couple standing before him. He called it the clearest case of self-defense he'd ever seen and left them to the silence of their valley. The violence had been a cleansing fire, burning away the last vestiges of the contract that had brought them together. What remained was something forged, not negotiated. In the weeks that followed, a new peace settled over the ranch. It was a peace earned, not given. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the pristine sky, Ilara placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm. "The contract is void," she said softly. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. A few months later, the truth of their new life became undeniable. Ilara was pregnant. The child, a daughter born the following spring, was named Rowan. She had her mother's formidable height and her father's quiet, watchful eyes. They raised her in the rhythm of the land, teaching her its language of hard work and resilience. Caleb taught her how to mend a fence, his large, calloused hands guiding her small ones. Ilara taught her how to shoot, her steady gaze instilling a calm confidence. The western quarter of the ranch was never mentioned. The $100 and the horse were forgotten. They were no longer two separate entities bound by a deal, but a family, their roots grown together deep in the stubborn soil. Years passed like seasons, each one etching deeper lines of contentment onto their faces. The ranch thrived, a testament to their shared strength. Caleb and Ilara grew old together, their movement slower, their silence richer. His hair turned the color of winter frost, and the giantess of the valley leaned on him now, just as he had once leaned on her. Their daughter, Rowan, grew into the legacy they had built. She was a synthesis of them both, tall and strong like her mother, with her father's unshakable calm and deep well of kindness. She ran the ranch now, her presence as commanding and natural as the mountains that framed their home. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Caleb and Ilara sat on the porch swing he had built for her decades ago. It moved with a gentle, rhythmic creak. He finally spoke of Sarah and his son, not with the sharp agony of loss, but with the soft, distant tenderness of a healed scar. "I thought I'd never have a life again," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. He looked at Ilara, her profile noble against the fading light. "You gave me back the world," she smiled, a true, warm smile that reached her winter sky eyes. "You were always strong, Caleb. You just needed a place to stand." Their story became a quiet legend in the valley, the tale of the giant widow and the broken survivor, of a bargain that became a vow, of a love forged not in whispered sweetness, but in shared labor, silent understanding, and the ferocious will to protect what is precious. A testament to the fact that sometimes, the most profound love stories aren't about finding a perfect person, but about two imperfect souls building a perfect life from the rubble of their past. We hope their story of resilience and love moved you. It's tales like these, of strength found in the darkest of times, that we strive to share. If you were inspired by Caleb and Ilara's journey, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing you stories that matter. Thank you for watching.